Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Tom Wallace and welcome to the second episode of the Contrarian Investor Podcast. Be sure to go back and listen to the blockbuster first episode featuring natural resource investment legend and CEO of Sprott Global Resources, Mr. Rick Rule. Joining me on the line today is world-famous Australian economist and best-selling author, Professor Steve Keen. Professor Keen was one of the few economists who accurately predicted the crisis of 2008, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking with him today. Professor Keen, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Professor Keen, is the Australian property market overvalued?
Oh, it's overvalued. The best data we have to take a look at how Australia compares globally has been put together by the Bank of International Settlements recently. You can find common data for about 20 countries going back to 1985. And if you take the Australian data, it actually starts in 86 in Australia, but you can actually get a little extension of that using long-term work by a New South Wales University economist, Stapleton, and compare our prices from 1985 on to the rest of the world. And there's only 4 countries that have had the same level of increase in real house prices compared to consumer prices over that period of time. And those 4 countries have all seen their prices double in real terms. That's England, Australia, Netherlands, and Belgium, those 4. Others, of course, have had their house prices double and crash right back down again. That's, of course, obviously the United States, but also Spain. So we're the only 4, I think, remaining bubbles in terms of the real cost of buying a home over that period of time. And there's many other factors that I'd include apart from that. But fundamentally, I see housing as something you have to consume. Ultimately, it's a consumption item. It's not an investment item, except during periods of, when the house prices diverge from consumer prices. And to drive that divergence up, you have to have an enormous increase in debt, and that's precisely what we've had. So we have more expensive houses because people are borrowing more money to pay for them. And that ultimately led to financial crises in America and Spain and Ireland and various other places. And I think we're just fooling ourselves to think that we're sound to have prices that are so much out of whack with consumer goods, which ultimately you have to sell to buy houses.
Why didn't the Australian property market experience a significant pullback like the US markets did at the start of the GFC?
Well, there's 2 main reasons. We had a more extreme increase in the level of private and household debt than America had. If you look over the period from 1990 to 2007, when the American bubble well and truly burst, their mortgage debt levels went from about 40% of GDP to about 85% of GDP. We went from 20% to 86%. So we had a bigger increase in mortgage debt than the Americans had. What then happened was America, of course, the bubble burst and down come the house prices. But mortgage rates don't come down in America because most people, they take out fixed term rates. And in Australia, of course, when the crisis hit and the Reserve Bank finally realised it was in a crisis, remember for the first 6 months to a year of the global financial crisis, it was putting interest rates up in the belief there were dangers of inflation, the exact opposite of what happened both locally and globally. But when they finally realised it was a crisis and they started cutting rates by 1% at a time, each time they cut those rates, they of course completely passed on to to borrowers. So the fact that we have floating rates meant that the pressure of having to repay the mortgage was drastically reduced. Whereas in America, even though the Federal Reserve was cutting rates just as fast as the Australians did and starting to cut them more earlier in the piece, that didn't get passed on to your own mortgage unless you refinance. So people therefore had mortgages that they couldn't meet, they were forced to go bankrupt, and that caused a chain reaction that drove prices lower. People didn't have to sell to get out of their mortgages, to reduce the burden of their mortgages in Australia. They simply paid lower repayments. And that was a major factor. The other was the scale of the stimulus program that Australia put into place. Now, this is being debated in the usual ludicrous terms in Parliament right now, that deficits are always a bad thing. Australia was the only developed nation not to suffer a recession during the global financial crisis. And the only reason for it was the scale of the stimulus program that went in. Yes, I know ThinkBats were a total disaster and the school program was nonsense, etc., etc., etc. But the fact is the government spent an enormous amount of money into the economy, gave everybody with a pulse got $1,000 to spend, if you remember, at that time. And that meant a tremendous stimulus to spending. And, of course, my least favourite government policy came into play, which is what I call the first-home vendors boost, where they doubled and trebled the amount of money they gave to first-home buyers to encourage them to buy a house. And that, in my calculations, injected about $100 billion into the economy over 18 months. both through the amount of money the government put to first-home buyers and then the leverage that first-home buyers applied to that money. So if you look at what was happening to mortgage debt at the time the crisis began, what actually did happen, if the trend that had applied when the crisis began continued, the gap between where mortgage debt would have ended up and where it did end up after the first-home vendors boost was roughly $100 billion. Now, if you spend $100 billion into an economy which is roughly $1 trillion economy over 18 months, you're boosting demand by about 6% each year. So the combination of the strong stimulus, the first-home vendors boost, stimulating the economy through causing a house price bubble, and then the fact that the Reserve could reduce the pressure on borrowers by cutting rates and that flowed through to borrowers. Those three factors got us through. And therefore you didn't see any deleveraging by the Australian household sector. So if you look at the level of mortgage debt, the rate of change of mortgage debt has never been negative in Australia, whereas the rate of change of mortgage debt in America was negative for about 3 years.
I know it's hard to time these sorts of things, but when do you think we're going to start to see a correction?
Well, at the moment, then the correction I think is ages away, because there's two additional factors that keep on letting this bubble reflate. And these are the two factors that matter right now are overseas purchases of properties, the fact that 100% of new properties can be purchased by non-residents, which I think is an insane allowance in policy. If it's meaning, what are you building the houses for? Housing is an export industry. Why don't we dig them up and sell them like we sell everything else? To me, it's insane that we allow 100% of new properties to be purchased by overseas buyers. But that, of course, is exposing us to the monumentally larger Chinese economy and the capacity of wealthy Chinese to buy and get their property out of China, which, if you've seen the air in China, is an extremely sensible thing to do if you're Chinese, get the hell out of the air over there. So that is one factor which could go on indefinitely. And the other factor is the insane public policy, which I think was one of the last decisions of the Howard government, of allowing self-managed superannuation funds to take leverage positions in property and call it investing. So that means that something like $500 billion worth of superannuation money could be levered into the property market. And so long as people don't mind a complete dissociation between rental yields on property and the prices they're getting on property, those combination of factors could keep this bubble going for another 2 to 4 years. So I don't think there's any end for it in sight. What could bring it to an end would be, first of all, there are no more first-home buyers on the market. And that's barely an exaggeration to say that. But I think if people start realising that there's absolutely nobody to sell to other than other speculators, superannuation funds who are also effectively speculating, and then overseas buyers who are buying insurance against political change and against the actual climate in China, maybe one of those factors could mean people pull out of buying existing homes in Australia and the bubble bursts. But I certainly can't see it popping for the next year or two.
Professor Keane, China has experienced unprecedented growth over the past 30 years. Is it going to continue this way?
Well, I don't think it's going to continue because you simply can't keep doubling every 10 years as they've been doing for the last 3 decades, or more than doubling. There's a little rule of thumb most people don't know, and that is if you divide the rate of growth of an economy into the number 70, you get a doubling period. So if you're growing at 7% per annum, which is seen as a slow rate of growth for China, that's doubling every 10 years. And of course, they've been growing at 8 and 9%, doubling every 7 years. That simply can't be sustained indefinitely. You can do it while you're catching up, but ultimately you run out of catch-up room when you've got almost all your rural workers that can be transferred, that the cities have transferred, your unemployment rate's fallen towards zero. Then you start to slow down because you've simply reached that ceiling. And Japan went through a similar process itself from 1945 through to about 1970. So it has to slow down. The other side of things is that one of the reasons we continued to survive the global financial crisis was that we had, I think, the world's third largest stimulus program. The largest was China's. And that's what they got out of the financial crisis by causing a new bubble to occur in their property, and that's got to be the most opaque system on the planet. I'm not willing to make any call on when I think something's going wrong in China because that would involve trusting Chinese data. I'm not about to do that, but certainly it looks like there's enormous loss-making ventures throughout the Chinese system, from state-level government speculating, local government speculation, individuals speculating as well. and the usual story about ghost cities in China and so on and so forth. But as to how long it could go on for, again, timing I think is impossible in that situation. And even if the Chinese do have a crisis, and I think they will at some point have a crunch, when they do, they've got enormous reserves to fight that. They don't have, because they've been running a gigantic trade surplus, and they've got the amount of money they've been using to quarantine to stop the renminbi revaluing, as it should have done with their trade surpluses. They've got far more of a capacity to intervene in their markets and to write bad debts off and restructure organisations that have failed or bail out others. And the Chinese are quite ruthless at making decisions like that. They don't have any of the niceties of believing conventional economic theory that applies in the West, and they don't have any political niceties about treading on the toes of banks as well. So I do expect them to suffer a crisis, but I also expect them to have a more effective rescue than other countries. If I had to pick what I think might cause a real change in China, it's more the environmental issue. Because if you take a look at the level of pollution that's applying there right now, I think at some stage the environment will become as important a political issue as food once was. And you may then get a shift in the decision-making directions of China away from rapid growth towards rapid attenuation of environmental damage, particularly air pollution. And then that could have a very direct flow-through on profitability of industry, on the property market as well, more so than a financial crisis.
What's the quality of Australian economic data?
Our data, generally speaking, is up to global standards. The only trouble is global standards themselves have been compromised over the last 40 years because there have been about 18 redefinitions of what unemployment is, and each one of them has reduced the recorded rate. That's got to be suspicious. And I think back in the 1960s, unemployment simply said, if you answered a survey and said, are you out of work and are you looking for work, the answer to both those questions was yes, you ticked off the box for you being unemployed. Now you've asked, have you done any paid or unpaid work of more than 1 hour in the last 2 weeks? And are you immediately available for work, or are you looking for work but not available for work immediately? All those questions reduce the recorded rate. And if you notice, Roy Morgan, and hats off to the Roy Morgan organisation, got so disgusted with this distorted way in which the unemployment numbers were being recorded that they've been doing their own survey every month, asking people the old two questions: are you out of work? Are you looking for work? And if they answer those questions yes, Roy Morgan records them as unemployed. Now, they don't seasonally adjust it. They manipulate the data to take out the impact of summer and school leavers and stuff like that. But their unemployment rate is running at about the 10 to 11% rate for Australia. And I think that's more what people are feeling. That's more the actual level of unemployment that we're experiencing. So 6%, which itself is bad on historical standards, is substantially less than the actual unemployment rate. And the same thing applies in America. Their recorded rate's about 6.5% now. That's what they call the U3 rate, and that has the same definition, twists and then some, that our definition has. But they have another one they call U6, and that takes into account longer-term discouraged workers and so on, and that's running at about 14% right now.
What is one of the demographic challenges that Australia is going to have to face?
Well, the main thing is that the baby boomers are finally no longer booming babies. If you look at the population hump we got out of the baby boomers is gone. There are less children being had by the following generation, and the baby boomers proportionately are a bulk. They're a hump in the population distribution. So, of course, we know, and this is Harry Dent's work. Of course, Harry's the expert on this stuff. That means that you're likely to have baby boomers wanting to sell properties rather than buy at some point. They're going to want to turn that dramatic bubble in house prices, which has occurred in their lifetime. They're shopping for housing lifetime too, I might add. The bubble really began back in 89 with Keating doubling, reintroducing this for the second time, the first home owners scheme, deliberately to cause a bubble after the stock market crash of 87 and the fear that there was going to be a depression. So baby boomers want to capitalise that. Of course, to do it, they've got to sell their properties. They've got to find buyers to sell the properties to. Because they're existing properties, they can't be overseas buyers. They've got to be Australian residents. And on that front, with the price levels being what they are, they simply might not find the prices come through. But that's the factor that Harry is focusing on and saying, which may cause house prices to plunge. I think it probably will, but I think he's when he made his call, I think about a 37% fall in a very, very short time period. That, I think, didn't factor in the impact of these two other factors, the overseas buyers and the superannuation funds. But nonetheless, that demographic cliff is still sitting there, and I don't think overseas buyers can rescue us from that, nor can ultimately superannuation funds, because of course they're all going to be wanting to sell their investments, so-called, and turn them into cash, not at the same time, but across the same period of time.
Professor, what investment sector has you excited going forward?
To me, the problem with investment is that you actually need a certain amount of borrowed money coming into the economy to enable new investments to take place. We need an expansion of demand that extra borrowed money causes. And because we've actually lived off the teat of rising debt levels for so long, the finance isn't going to be there to enable a lot of investment to go forward. If I had to say what I'd like to see people investing in, it's in developments like 3D printing and where that can take us in a whole range of areas, nanotechnology, biotechnology. There's lots of extremely intelligent, interesting ideas being developed at the high-tech end, which is always where progress comes in humanity. But what's going on instead is people are looking for the short 3-month profit and turnaround. And to me, that's what's been incredibly disappointing about the way the Australian economy has changed over time and how the Australian mindset has changed. We're all looking at how can we make a profit out of unearned income. We're not looking at how can we support entrepreneurial visions. And to me, that's why we're growing more slowly, because ultimately we've exhausted all the possible quick, cheap, no-work sources of income. The one left, of course, is the property bubble, and everybody's pouring into it at the one time.
Professor Keane, your book, where can my listeners find it?
It's one book called Debunking Economics, and I wrote it, the first edition of that book I wrote back in 2000, or published in 2000, 2001, because I could feel that something was moving in the global financial system, and though I wasn't expecting a crisis back then, I thought that now is the time to start saying economic theory can't be trusted. Conventional economic theory is a load of nonsense, and let the public know that they shouldn't trust conventional economics. And then I rewrote the book, substantially revised after the crisis came, and published in 2011. And that's available, the usual story, through Amazon, booksellers and so on. So just look for the title, Debunking Economics.
Where can everyone follow your work and find you on the web?
I've got, the main thing I can see me these days, I'm writing a column for Business Spectator. So if they go to businessspectator.com.au, 3 S's in Spectator, by the way, in the middle, then you can locate my columns there. And then I also have my blog, debtdeflation.com/blogs. Those are the 2 main sites. There's actually a third one being formed, I think it's called stevekeen.net, being put together by a good friend and somebody I have a lot of respect for. And that's going to be going live in a short while. That'll also be a subscription site.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to world-renowned economist and best-selling author Professor Steve Keane. Professor Keane, it's been an honour to have you on the show today, and thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Tom.
The new social media publishing platform for liberty-minded individuals, liberty.me, is getting ready for launch. If you want to be connected to some of the brightest entrepreneurs in the entire world, like Jeffrey Tucker, Rick Rule, Doug Casey, and Stefan Molyneux, all brought together under the one roof, head to www.liberty.me and sign up today. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you found the information useful, please share it with your friends. Have a great week.